Why could the old beds of the pioneers of the Wild West provide more warmth than the most modern sleeping bags designed for extreme cold? When temperatures dropped to a critical -40 degrees Fahrenheit, it was not just a test of endurance for the settlers, but a daily struggle for life, and their sleeping quarters became the last bastion against the deadly cold. They did not have synthetic fillers and high-tech membranes, but they possessed secrets based on a deep understanding of nature and the physics of heat that we seem to have lost forever. Their sleeping systems were an engineering marvel, assembled from the simplest natural materials: fur, feathers, wood, and wool. And this multi-layered construction worked flawlessly. The night on the frontier was full of dangers, but the most insidious of them was always the frost that penetrated walls and clothing. And only a properly equipped bed guaranteed dawn. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a simple combination of natural materials and centuries-old knowledge allowed people on the frontier to survive in conditions that today seem impossible without modern equipment. What if I told you that the earth beneath the floor of the hut was part of the pioneers' bed heating system? Something that almost no one knows about. The warmth in a pioneer's hut did not start with the bed, but with the floor, and this was the first, most important, though invisible, layer of protection from the bitter cold. Most early settlements were built with earthen floors or log floors raised only slightly above the ground, which allowed natural heat to be retained and used. This design created a kind of heat accumulator that slowly released the stored heat throughout the night, acting as a passive heater. In addition, earthen floors or low wooden floors significantly reduce drafts, which are one of the main enemies of heat conservation in a room. In the center or near one of the walls, there was always a stone hearth or stove, which was lit in the evening, and its heat was the central element of the entire heating strategy of the house. The stones and clay that made up the hearth had incredible heat capacity, allowing them to accumulate enormous reserves of heat, which were then slowly released into the air and floor. In fact, the hearth worked on the principle of a modern fireplace stove, but was much more massive and inefficient in terms of wood consumption, but it did not allow the temperature to drop sharply. Pioneers often slept near the hearth or even on the floor next to it to make the most of the residual heat radiated by its massive stone masonry. This proximity to the heat source was a deliberate decision, not just a random choice of sleeping place. The construction of the walls from logs or turf also contributed to this effect, creating a massive thermal barrier. Thick logs or layers of turf were not ideal insulators, but their mass significantly smoothed out daily temperature fluctuations, preventing the interior from cooling down quickly. The gaps between the logs were filled with clay, moss, or mud, creating log cabins that were very dense and heavy, which was much more important for slow heat loss than for instant insulation. It was this mass of materials, rather than their insulating properties, that allowed the hut to remain relatively warm in the harshest frosts. This architecture was a response to the harsh continental climate of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Thus, the air inside the hut, although cold near the ceiling, remained warmer and calmer near the floor, forming a warm blanket for those who slept low. This warm layer of air was the first non-man-made element of the pioneer bed heating system, and it was unavailable to those who slept on high beds or in drafty tents. Pioneers deliberately placed their sleeping quarters as close to the floor and the hearth as possible, using simple gravity to keep the warm air down. They understood that height was the enemy of warmth in a primitive dwelling and tried to avoid it at all costs. The bed, which was often just a wooden platform or a roughly nailed frame, stood in the most protected corner, away from the only door and the tiny windows covered with skin or oiled parchment. This placement was the second strategic step after working with the floor, and it minimized direct contact with the icy drafts that penetrated through any opening. On the coldest nights, the corners near the hearth became the most desirable places to sleep, and sometimes they had to be shared with several family members or companions. This was a practical necessity dictated by harsh conditions, not just a custom. The walls of the hut on the north and west sides were often made thicker and without windows to block the prevailing winds in the most intense cold. This passive method of house planning was already known to European settlers and Native American tribes, and it was used extensively on the frontier. This layout provided a significant advantage in the struggle to retain heat by reducing the area exposed to the elements. A small but well-designed hut was a much more effective shelter than a large and poorly insulated one. Sometimes pioneers used air pockets filled with dry straw or leaves under the floor, which served as additional, albeit primitive, insulation. This measure not only retained the heat of the earth, but also prevented cold moisture from seeping in, which was no less important for comfortable sleep. Such improvised insulation required regular renewal, but its effectiveness in harsh winters was undeniable. Straw, grass, or dry leaves became valuable building materials for retaining heat. Particular attention was paid to ensuring that the bed was not placed against a cold outer wall, but against an inner wall adjacent to the hearth or an internal partition, if there was one. This allowed the residual heat that passed through the wall from the hearth to be used, even when it was no longer burning, acting as a panel heater. A bed leaning against such a warm wall received a constant, albeit weak, flow of heat throughout the night. This was further confirmation that the location of the bed had been carefully thought out. Thus, the pioneer's bed was part of a complex, though invisible, heating system in the house, where every element, from the hearth to the floor, worked to conserve precious heat. This system could be called passive thermoregulation, in which there were no moving parts or complex technologies. The entire hut was built around the idea of survival in the cold, and the sleeping area was its culmination. Modern sleeping bags insulate a person from the cold, while the pioneer's bed was integrated into the warmth of the house. Incredible but true. Without thermometers, the pioneers intuitively used the principles of thermal mass and convection to survive the winter. What element of their dwelling, other than the stove, do you think played a key role in retaining heat? Be sure to subscribe to our channel to learn more about life on the frontier. What if I told you that the secret to staying warm in 40 to 40 degree weather was quantity, not quality? Modern sleeping bags operate on the principle of minimalism, lightweight and maximum insulation in a single layer. Pioneers, on the other hand, relied on the genius of layering, creating a complex bedding system where each layer served a unique function. This multi-level structure was specifically designed to capture and retain the heat of the human body, preventing it from escaping. It was the principle of multi-layering that made their bed more effective than any sleeping bag, even the most expensive ones. The bottom layer, lying on a wooden floor or the ground, was often a thick straw mat, or, if you were lucky, a mattress stuffed with corn cobs or wool. This layer played a critical role. It separated the sleeper from the cold coming from below, creating the first, crude but effective thermal barrier. Straw or leaves, although short-lived, were excellent insulators, creating many air pockets that retained heat. The mattress was the first line of defense against the cold of the ground. On top of this rough barrier, a second, softer base was laid, and it was here that the famous feather bed often appeared, a mattress stuffed with goose or duck down. The feather bed was not just an item of luxury or comfort, it was a vital tool for survival, providing incredible thermal insulation. Down is one of the best natural insulators, and a layer of perina several dozen centimeters thick created an insurmountable barrier to heat loss. It was a real thermal cocoon that enveloped the body on all sides. The third layer, on which the person slept directly, consisted of thick woolen or linen blankets, often sewn from scraps, which made them even denser and warmer. These blankets were designed to absorb the moisture that inevitably was released by the body during the night and to serve as a buffer between the body and the down quilt. Wool, even when wet, retains its warming properties, which made it indispensable in conditions of high temperature fluctuations. It was functional underwear, not just interior decoration. Next came a system of upper blankets, where quantity was synonymous with reliability. Several thick blankets, animal skins, felt or quilted covers. Each new layer added air pockets, and it was the air trapped between the layers that was the main insulator in this system. The more layers there were, the less likely it was that cold air would penetrate the body, and the more reliably the heat emitted by the body was retained. The layers of blankets were laid with a slight overlap to cover any gaps or loose spots through which cold could penetrate. It was a practical art of layering that required attention to detail to create a uniform and impermeable thermal barrier. The corner of the bed adjacent to the wall often received an extra layer of insulation to compensate for heat loss through the cold wall. Thus, the pioneer's bed was a thermal fortress. Every night before bedtime, bedding was often shaken or fluffed to restore maximum volume to the down and wool. This was necessary to restore the air pockets that had been crushed during the night and to ensure maximum thermal insulation for the coming hours. This simple routine procedure was critical to the effectiveness of the entire system. This multi-layered construction had another advantage. It allowed for temperature regulation. Depending on the severity of the night, a person could add or remove 1 or 2 top layers, thus preventing overheating, which, like hypothermia, could be dangerous. This flexibility was not available in the rigid construction of early sleeping bags. At the same time, the weight of this entire structure was enormous. Sometimes a person had to sleep under a weight that would seem excessive today, but this weight was an integral part of the thermal strategy. The heaviness of the blankets and skins ensured a snug fit to the body, leaving no space for cold air to circulate. Therefore, the pioneer's sleeping system was not just a bed, but an entire heat machine that used the brute force of insulation and natural materials. It is incredible that such a simple but massive structure could withstand the frosts that today require complex synthetic technology. Layering is the key to understanding warmth in frontier conditions. But what do you think? If the pioneers had such effective bedding, why did they need additional heating with hot objects? Watch until the end to learn the secret that will change your perception of down comforters. Are you ready to learn that the most valuable thing in a feather bed is not the down itself, but the air it traps? The feather bed, or down mattress, was not just a symbol of comfort, but a key element of survival, and its design was the result of centuries of experience. The main secret of down's effectiveness lies in its unique structure. Each feather consists of thousands of ultrafine fibers that intertwine to create a huge number of tiny air pockets. It is this trapped air, rather than the material itself, that is the main insulator, preventing body heat from escaping. The best, lightest, and most voluminous down was used for the filling, mainly goose or duck down. Dense, stiff down from the neck and chest was the best because it clumped less and retained its fluffy structure longer. It took months of painstaking work to collect this down, and it was one of the most valuable family heirlooms that settlers took with them to the frontier. The quality of the down was directly related to the chances of survival in the harsh winter. The duvet cover was sewn from very dense, durable fabric, often linen or heavy cotton, to prevent the sharp ends of the feathers from poking through and to keep the down in place. This fabric had to be dense enough to prevent air and tiny particles of down from escaping, yet strong enough to withstand constant pressure. Often, the cover was stitched with special stitches to prevent the down from clumping in one corner and to distribute it evenly across the entire surface of the mattress. The real magic of the feather bed lay in its thickness. The down feather bed was very high, often up to 30 centimeters, and a person literally sank into it, finding themselves completely surrounded by warm air. This immersion created an ideal thermal cocoon that enveloped the body on all sides, minimizing contact with the cold air in the room. No modern sleeping bag can replicate this effect of evenly distributed insulation. The feather bed served two purposes. It not only insulated from below, but also acted as a huge warm blanket from above. When a person lay down on it, the down rose up on the sides, creating a kind of thermal barrier that prevented the heated air from escaping. This was a key difference from a conventional mattress, which only insulates from below. The problem was that the down would eventually become compressed and lose its volume, which drastically reduced its insulating properties. Therefore, daily fluffing and periodic drying of the feather bed in the sun was a mandatory procedure on the frontier. Women spent a lot of time and effort to restore the down to its original fluffiness and maintain its effectiveness. In the harshest conditions, pioneers could use two feather beds. One was placed under them, and the second was used to cover them, creating a double layer of down insulation. Such a down sandwich guaranteed survival even in the most bitter frosts and was the ultimate manifestation of thermal luxury on the frontier. It was the maximum possible protection from the cold. The value of a feather bed on the frontier was so high that it often became an item of inheritance or dowry. It was not just an everyday item, but an investment in the health and life of the family. Losing a feather bed in winter could be a disaster, so it was cherished and protected. Down insulation was so effective because it worked with moisture. Down is able to wick moisture away from the body, keeping it dry, which is critical for warmth. Dry heat is always more effective than wet heat, and down did this better than many other materials of the era. Thus, the feather bed was not just a soft place to sleep, but a highly effective, albeit labor-intensive, thermal device. Its secret lies in the ingenious use of air pockets and the ability of natural materials to retain volume. Click the like button below this video if you think this ancient secret deserves our attention. Guess which material kept pioneers warmer than any wool? Along with down, one of the most effective and perhaps most affordable insulators in the Wild West was wild animal fur. Hides, especially those of bison or buffalo and beaver, were an indispensable part of the bedding system, providing not only warmth, but also protection from moisture and wind. The bison hide, with its thick skin and dense, long fur, was simply the perfect natural blanket for the harshest winters. Bison hides were mainly used as the bottom or top layer of the bed. If the hide was placed on the bottom, fur side up, it created an incredibly dense and warm barrier against the cold floor, providing a second level of insulation after the straw bedding. If the hide was used as a top blanket, it was laid fur side down to retain as much body heat as possible. The thickness of the bison hide and its ability to block the wind made it unbeatable. The special value of bison fur lay in its structure. The thick undercoat and stiff guard hairs formed two layers of insulation that prevented the cold from penetrating through the thickness of the fur. When the hide was worn on the body, it created a dense, heavy cover, leaving no chance for cold air to circulate. It was a kind of natural hooded blanket that could be pulled up to the chin. Beaver fur, although much smaller, was valued for its density and water resistance. Beaver skins were often sewn together to create small but incredibly warm blankets or sleeping bags that were used by mountain trappers. The dense undercoat of the beaver was virtually impervious to moisture, which was critical in high humidity or melting snow conditions. Trappers and hunters also used bear and wolf skins. These furs were less common than bison, but their insulating properties were no less impressive. Bearskin was used as a mattress on the snow, providing a dry and warm place to rest even in the wildest places. The leather base of the skin, or hide, also played a role. It was a dense, natural, windproof layer. Turned fur side in, it not only provided warmth, but also protected against drafts coming through the thin walls of a hut or tent. It was the first natural windbreaker in history. Before use, the skins were carefully treated to remain soft and flexible, even in the cold. Improperly tanned hides could become stiff, crumpled, and lose their insulating properties. So the art of tanning was a vital skill on the frontier. Treatment with fat or special solutions helped to preserve their elasticity. The hides required constant care. They had to be regularly beaten, aired, and dried to prevent rotting, getting wet, and losing their insulating properties. Any accumulation of moisture in the fur could quickly turn to ice, so keeping it dry was a priority. The use of fur was a practical reflection of the principle of whatever is at hand will save you. Unlike imported wool, bison hides were available right on the Great Plains, and hunting them was a matter of survival. Fur served not only as bedding, but also as versatile clothing and even shelter. These natural blankets were heavy, but their weight was not a disadvantage but part of a thermal strategy that ensured a snug fit and eliminated drafts. It is this combination of weight and insulation that is the secret to their superiority over lightweight modern sleeping bags. But even under a thick bison hide, it was possible to get cold. How do you think the pioneers kept their beds warm without electricity or modern heaters? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of how they turn stones into sources of heat. Despite all the layers of fur and down, pioneers often resorted to additional heat sources to ward off the damp cold that penetrated their beds. These techniques were simple but required care and careful preparation to avoid burns and fires. They worked on the principle of a thermal anchor, adding extra external energy to the bed. The most common and simplest method was to use heated stones or bricks. Stones, specially selected for their ability to retain heat, or ordinary fire bricks, were heated in the hearth to a high temperature after the fire had died down. They became portable heaters that could be placed directly in bed. Before placing the stone or brick under the blanket, it was always wrapped in a thick layer of fabric or old clothing. This was done for two reasons. First, to avoid burns, and second, to slow down the cooling process, causing the heat to be released slowly over several hours. A stone wrapped in several layers of wool could provide noticeable warmth until dawn. Stones and bricks were usually placed not at the foot of the bed, but in the center so that the heat was evenly distributed throughout the sleeping area. This allowed the mattress and blankets to warm up, creating a comfortable temperature inside the cocoon before a person lay down. A warm bed is, of course, much more pleasant and safer than a cold one. Sometimes metal containers were used for this purpose. Cast iron irons, which were heated on the fire for ironing, or even tightly closed metal cans filled with hot coals, served as improvised hot water bottles. Cast iron, like stone, has a high heat capacity and retains heat for a very long time. Porcelain or ceramic hot water bottles were a special luxury available only in more affluent settlements. These bottle-like vessels were filled with boiling water and tightly sealed with a cork. They were less dangerous in terms of burns than stones and did not pose a risk of ignition. Families who slept together also used each other's bodies as additional heat anchors. This was not just a custom, but a necessity. People sleeping close together warmed each other, and the total area of heat loss was reduced. This method was one of the most effective and reliable on the frontier. The technique of warming the bed was a vital skill, especially for those who slept alone or in poorly heated buildings. A warm bed did not require the body to expend energy warming cold blankets, allowing it to conserve strength for the next day. This was an important element of daily thermoregulation. An important point was that these items were never placed directly on the body, but always between layers of blankets or under the mattress. In this way, the heat rose slowly, warming the air inside the bed without burning the skin. It was a subtle science of passive heating. In the morning, after the stones or bricks had cooled down, they were returned to the hearth to repeat the process the following night. It was a closed cycle of heat energy use that minimized the consumption of firewood for nighttime heating. These items were indispensable. In this way, the pioneers used the thermal mass of stones and metal to charge their beds with thermal energy for the entire night. This simple and ancient method was a reliable addition to the multi-layered insulation system. Want to know a secret that all the pioneers knew but you don't? The location of the bed in a cabin or shelter was not a random choice, but the result of careful, strategic planning. The right placement of the bed could mean the difference between a peaceful night and a night spent fighting the cold. In frontier conditions, every inch of space mattered in the battle for warmth. The ideal place for a bed was in the corner of the cabin, adjacent to two interior walls, or the wall with the hearth. The corner was usually the least drafty place, and the wall adjacent to the hearth provided residual heat, as we discussed earlier. Placing the bed in the corner also minimized the area exposed to drafts from the door and windows. Beds on the frontier were often primitive, consisting of frames nailed together from boards or poles. They were made as low as possible so that they would be in the warmest layer of air, which, as we know, rose from the floor. The sleeper was in this warm lake, while cold air accumulated near the outer wall and ceiling. If the family was large, the beds were placed as close to each other as possible. This created a heat island effect, where several bodies covered with shared blankets or skins generated a common, much more powerful heat. Sleeping together was not only a social norm, but also an important element of survival in harsh conditions. Temporary shelters, such as dugouts or wigwams, were also built with thermal strategy in mind. The sleeping area was located in the center, away from the entrance, which was the only source of cold air. Often, the entrance to a dugout was long and winding to create an airlock that blocked the wind. For mountaineers and trappers who slept outdoors, the choice of location was even more critical. They always chose a place under an overhanging rock, in dense spruce thickets, or on the side of a hill protected from the wind. This provided a natural windbreak that was just as important as the bed itself. When creating a primitive bed on the ground, whether in a dugout or in the open air, thick bedding made of spruce branches was always used. The branches laid in a thick layer not only served as a mattress, but also created an air pocket separating the body from the frozen ground. It was a kind of natural analog of a straw mattress. Trappers often used their bison skins to create a completely enclosed cocoon around themselves, literally wrapping themselves in them with their heads. This created an enclosed space that quickly heated up from body heat and did not let it escape. This method was known as the mountain man's sleeping bag. Special attention was paid to avoiding drafts that could arise from gaps in the floor or walls. If a corner of the bed was found to be drafty, the pioneer would immediately plug the gap with dirt, rags, or snow. It was a constant nighttime vigilance. Thus, on the frontier, the bedroom was not just a room, but part of a complex system where the bed was placed at the point of maximum thermal advantage. The cold always penetrated, but knowing where its impact was minimal allowed for survival. What do you think was the most difficult thing for a pioneer? Enduring the cold or coping with the constant feeling of isolation and danger? In the next chapter, we will talk about how the pioneer's clothing became an additional layer of insulation. On the frontier, it was not customary to undress completely before going to bed, and the clothes a pioneer wore during the day often became an integral part of his nighttime heating system. Wearing clothes in bed was not so much a habit as a practical necessity that added another layer of insulation to those already in place. This layer was especially important because it was closest to the body. The main element of nightwear, if any, was long woolen or cotton underwear. This type of underwear, which covered the entire body, was designed to retain heat and wick away moisture, and it was the first line of defense against the cold. Good underwear helped to avoid the chills that could occur when sweaty skin came into contact with cold air. Hunters and trappers, especially those who slept outside their huts, often slept in their thick woolen shirts and sometimes even in their leather pants. These clothes were saturated with the smells of campfires and sweat, but their insulating properties were too valuable to give up. Wool, as we know, keeps you warm even when wet. The greatest heat loss was concentrated in the hands and feet. To prevent this, the pioneers used thick, hand-knitted woolen socks and mittens, which they wore to bed. The feet and hands, being extremities, cooled down the fastest, and keeping them warm was a priority. Headwear was another important element of nighttime gear. Many slept in woolen hats or the hoods of their jackets to prevent heat loss through the head, which is one of the main sources of heat loss. The body, covered with blankets, was protected, but the head often remained exposed. This extra layer of insulation provided by clothing was especially critical during the coldest hours of the night, just before dawn. When the fire had finally cooled down and the frost was at its peak, it was clothing that could be the last barrier against hypothermia. It was a kind of buffer between the body and the cold bed. Sometimes in the most extreme cold, the pioneers used their outer jackets or overcoats to cover their feet. The heavy, thick fabric from which the outer clothing was made provided additional weight and insulation where it was most needed. At the foot of the bed, which was often colder than the headboard, it was an improvised solution for local heating. Another important aspect was that the clothes worn in bed had to be dry. Wet or damp clothes, on the contrary, could cause a sharp drop in temperature. Therefore, before going to bed, the pioneers tried to dry their clothes as much as possible by the hearth before lying down. This approach to bedding as a multi-layered system, where even clothing plays a role, demonstrates how comprehensive their understanding of survival in the cold was. They did not rely on a single device or material, but used all the resources available to them. This combination is their main secret. The secrets of the warmth of the pioneers' beds become even more apparent when compared to the earliest versions of modern sleeping bags, which began to appear on the frontier. While the pioneer bed was a stationary, multi-layered structure, early sleeping bags were an attempt to achieve mobility at the expense of insulation quality. These first bags, often sewn from canvas and stuffed with wool or cotton, had a number of serious drawbacks. The first problem with early sleeping bags was the material. The cotton and wool used as filling easily became wet and clumped together, quickly losing their insulating properties, which was especially critical when sleeping outdoors. In contrast, the Pioneer's down comforter had better protection against moisture and could be dried. The second problem was the rigid design. Early sleeping bags were often sewn in the shape of an envelope, which did not fit snugly to the body and left a lot of empty space. A lot of cold air remained inside the bag, which the body had to warm up. The Pioneer's bed, with its feather bed and heavy blankets, enveloped the body more tightly. The mobility that was the main advantage of a sleeping bag was also its curse. A sleeping bag had to be carried around, which limited its size and weight, and therefore the thickness of the insulating layer. A Pioneer's stationary bed, on the other hand, could be as massive as desired, using all the resources available in the home. However, for mountain hunters and trappers who were constantly on the move, a sleeping bag was the only option. They often improvised using bison skins sewn into the shape of a bag, which combined mobility with the high thermal insulation of fur. Such bags were much more effective than commercial models. The secret to the effectiveness of the bison bag lay in the use of natural fur, which was superior to early synthetic and cotton fillers. The fur provided a waterproof outer layer and a dense insulating inner layer, which other materials could not provide. It is important to note that a sleeping bag only insulates the body inside it, but does not warm it. The Pioneer's bed, with its stones and proximity to the hearth, actively charged itself with heat from external sources. This was a fundamental difference in the approach to heating. Early sleeping bags also had a problem with condensation. Moisture released by the body accumulated inside, moistening the filling and reducing its thermal properties. The Pioneer's multi-layered bed allowed moisture to be distributed between different layers of wool and down. Modern sleeping bags have become very effective thanks to membranes and lightweight synthetic insulation. But in the Wild West era, when these technologies did not exist, a multi-layered bed made of natural materials was a more reliable solution. Thus, in the Wild West, mobility always came at the expense of comfort and warmth. For stationary survival in severe frosts, the Pioneer's multi-layered bed was undoubtedly the superior solution. The effectiveness of Pioneer beds in extreme cold was explained by the principle of thermal mass and inertia of the materials that made up their bedding. This principle states that the more massive and dense a material is, the slower it cools or heats up, and the Pioneers used this knowledge intuitively. Their beds were not just light layers of insulation, but heavy heat accumulators. The first element of this thermal mass is the feather bed itself in thick woolen blankets. Although down is light, it takes up a significant amount of space, and in order to cool down, it must release all of its accumulated heat. The multi-layered system slowed down this process. The second, more obvious element is the use of heavy animal skins, especially bison. The leather base of the skin was incredibly dense and heavy. When a person lay down under such a blanket, it instantly came into contact with the body, and the heat that began to be released did not penetrate through this dense mass to the outside, but was reflected back. The use of heated stones and bricks, which we discussed earlier, was a direct application of the principle of thermal inertia. A stone heated to a high temperature, thanks to its density and mass, could maintain the temperature in the bed throughout the night, acting as a small but long-lasting battery. Even the bed itself, the wooden floor or frame, had a certain thermal mass. Unlike a thin sheet of fabric, which cools instantly, thick boards or poles kept the air temperature in the hut longer than the surrounding environment. They acted as an insulating buffer between the body and the cold ground. This principle contrasts with modern sleeping bags, which focus on creating the lightest and most airy insulation possible to avoid thermal mass. In conditions where there are no external heat sources, this is effective. But on the frontier, where there was access to a hearth, thermal mass allowed the bed to be charged. The weight of blankets and skins was also important for eliminating air gaps. The tighter the blanket fit to the body, the less space there was for convection, the movement of cold air. The weight helped create an ideal, airtight thermal cocoon. The pioneers knew that their bedding had to be heavy. They intuitively understood that only a massive, multi-layered covering could withstand the onslaught of severe frost. This weight was the price they paid for survival. This principle of thermal mass was also evident in the construction of the house itself. The massive walls and floors we discussed in the first chapter served as a huge heat reservoir for the entire dwelling. The bed was its miniature, personal extension. Thus, the secret of frontier warmth lay not only in insulation, but also in the ability of materials to accumulate and release heat very slowly. It was a victory of density and weight over lightness. The entire pioneer bed heating system was closely linked to collective life and the peculiarities of the social atmosphere on the frontier. Survival alone was extremely difficult, and warmth was not just a physical phenomenon, but the result of joint efforts. Understanding this social aspect gives a complete picture of how people survived the harsh winters. Sleeping together in the same bed, or very close to each other, was the most direct manifestation of this collective warmth. When two or more people slept together, they shared their body heat, and the total area of their contact with the cold air was less than that of two people sleeping alone. It was the most effective and reliable heater. Children often slept with their parents or in the same bed with their brothers and sisters, which provided them with additional protection from the cold. This practice was common in many cultures, but on the frontier it became critical to survival. Another aspect of collective warmth was the willingness to share resources. If one settler had a bison hide or a warm quilt, he or she was likely to share it with neighbors or hutmates who did not have these resources. On the frontier, the survival of the entire group depended on mutual aid. Gathering down, shearing sheep for wool, sewing quilts from scraps. These were all collective, often female activities. The quilt that a pioneer lay down on was the result of the labor of many people, not just a purchased item. This handiwork guaranteed high quality. Evening time by the hearth was also part of the heating strategy. People spent as much time as possible by the fire, warming their clothes and bodies as much as possible before going to bed. They sat with their backs to the hearth, allowing the heat to soak into the thick fabric. Sometimes, if the hut was particularly cold, people would sleep in the common room, moving all their sleeping places as close to the hearth as possible. In such conditions, social hierarchy took a back seat to the common threat of cold. The frontier atmosphere also required a certain psychological resilience. Knowing that you were not alone in fighting the cold, and that the whole community was doing the same, helped to get through the harshest nights. It was a collective overcoming of the elements. This was especially evident in the dormitories of mining camps or at railway stations. Workers slept in cramped quarters, which, despite the unsanitary conditions, had a thermal advantage. Cramped quarters were synonymous with warmth. Thus, the warmth of the pioneers' beds was not only the result of engineering ingenuity, but also a reflection of the collective spirit of the frontier. Their survival was the result of community and mutual aid. We conclude our study of the unique heating system created by the pioneers of the Wild West to withstand the harshest frosts. From earthen floors that served as heat accumulators and massive stone hearths to the genius of layering in bed, every element of their daily life was subordinated to one goal: to survive in extreme cold. Their success lay in a deep, intuitive understanding of the physics of heat, the use of the principle of thermal mass, and the ability to transform the simplest natural materials, down, wool, fur, and stones, into highly effective insulators and heaters. The pioneer's bed was not just a place to sleep, but a complex passive thermal reactor. The history of these beds teaches us that human ingenuity and centuries-old knowledge can be just as effective as modern, complex technologies. They prove that the most important thing in the fight against the cold is not the price of the material, but its correct combination and strategic use. Which of the techniques we have discussed do you find most ingenious? The use of a down comforter, heat from the floor, or the use of heated stones? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the history of survival on the American frontier.